Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Dana Hinton, the president of the College of St. Benedict. And on behalf of my colleague, Michael Hemisath, president of St. John's University, and myself, it is a pleasure to welcome each of you to Liberal Arts Illuminated, Reframing the Narrative, Leadership Towards Inclusive Excellence. We gather together in this space this evening with a common goal: to reframe the narrative about the liberal arts and to leave with actionable, hopeful plans to help guide our inclusive excellence work on our campuses. We bring with us different backgrounds and experiences which will serve us mightily as we learn with and from one another over coming days. 2 years ago, the inaugural Liberal Arts Illuminated Conference brought together higher education leaders to discuss the future of the liberal arts. The gathering afforded the opportunity not only to address the challenges faced by the sector, but also to affirm and celebrate the core values that underpin a liberal arts education. The imperative of critical and creative thinking in relation to complex issues, the value of careful consideration of multiple and at times competing ideas and ways of understanding, and the ability to transform the boundaries of one's own context, culture, and experience towards a common purpose and individual freedom. This year, we ask how we live into those values in the face of a beautifully complex opportunity on all of our campuses: inclusive excellence. The talent we hold on our campuses right now is perhaps the most diverse in history. Countless articles and a surging body of research have evidenced the importance and impact of diversity and inclusion in the education and professional preparation of all students. The economic outcomes of underrepresented students who are able to attain a degree are substantive and consistent. And the case seems to be clear. Inclusive excellence is necessary for successful colleges and universities. And yet the challenges, demands, discrepant outcomes, and concerns related to diversity and inclusion have remained largely unchanged over many years. In fact, according to the American Council on Education, in 2016, 44% of two-year college presidents and 55% of four-year college presidents reported that the racial climate on their campus had become an increasingly high priority. This in the face of our knowledge that nearly every institution has added programs, people, and support in order to further multiculturalism, diversity, cultural competency, inclusive excellence, inclusion, and intersectionality. Likely all of us in this room have identified a person or an area with that task. And yet systematic gaps in student outcomes and access, student concerns about being isolated and marginalized, and challenges to the very value of inclusion lead our headlines each and every day. And at the same time, we find ourselves in a defensive posture when we hear the current narrative about the liberal arts. When I think of those two pieces together, I posit that the inclusion challenge in higher ed is not that we have not allocated sufficient funds or human resources towards these compelling issues, but rather that we have not consistently connected the value of the liberal arts and the will for transformative change to the demands of inclusion. To truly reach every student we serve, we must believe in their value and the freeing value of the liberal arts. This notion of a compelling link between education and inclusion is not a new one. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, an Enlightenment scholar, a proponent of women's education, and an abolitionist, wrote in 1786, "Freedom can only exist in the society of knowledge. Without learning, humans are incapable of knowing their rights, and where learning is confined to a few people, liberty can be neither equal nor universal." Therefore, the success of the liberal arts is inextricably linked to our ability to engage support, and graduate the increasingly diverse student bodies enriching our campus conversations. And the future value of the liberal arts depends on our true embrace of inclusive excellence and vice versa. Our opportunity to reframe and drive the narrative of the liberal arts depends on our ability to foster positive outcomes for all of our students. But we cannot make the needed changes merely by looking at our students and policies in isolation, which is what brings us here. Liberal Arts Illuminated seeks to understand what we need to do as faculty, administrators, presidents, staff, and trustees to prepare our campuses to engage in this important conversation and deploy the values and purposes of the liberal arts in support of inclusive excellence. We will address each of these questions over the next 2 days. One of our key objectives in planning this conference was to provide space for reflection and action-oriented conversation. Therefore, the conference goal is not only that we think about how we answer these questions, but that we each leave with a plan that, collectively, will enable us to make widespread change. So as we engage these conversations and questions, think about your campus and your context. For example, when I think about the College of St. Benedict, I recognize our inclusive excellence is tied to the fact that we're on a campus for women, founded by women, that we were founded to serve marginalized immigrant communities, and we're rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition and Benedictine values. Each one of you has a unique context that will guide how you think about and respond to these questions. And I hope you will keep that uppermost in your mind as we explore together a response through the liberal arts for inclusive excellence. So I thank you and honor you for your time and your presence with us. Our work together will enable us to reshape ourselves, our institutions, the current narrative, and the students who we have the privilege of serving. Students who come to us at any age and stage in life with the hope, the need, the desire to transform their lives. Students who entrust themselves to us and to whom we owe the opportunity to excel. I firmly believe that we must do this, that we can do this, and that we will do this. And I am grateful to do this work alongside you. So welcome to each and every one of you, and I will now invite my colleague, Michael Hemisath, to offer a few words before we begin dinner. And while he's making his way, just a logistical note, if you have a dietary request, it is listed on the back of your name tag. Just place it next to your place setting so that our wonderful catering and event staff is able to serve you appropriately. And again, welcome everyone.
Well, on behalf of the other part of this great partnership of St. Ben's and St. John's, I welcome you to St. Joseph, where you are presently, and to Collegeville, where you'll get a chance to visit tomorrow. We're delighted to have you here with us today. There was probably some reference made to this earlier, but I'm remembering this event from 2 years ago where we were, literally as we were getting up to welcome you, a tornado was making its way through central Minnesota, and we all went down and explored the infrastructure of the St. Ben's Campus Center, and it was in very good shape. We had an hour and a half or so to explore it together. Tonight, it's not quite so threatening weather-wise. It's a little warm for some of us Minnesotans, but compared to a tornado, we should count our blessings. So welcome to Minnesota and all of its delightful diversity. I want to start by thanking a number of individuals that made this event possible. Of course, these sorts of events take a tremendous amount of effort. Mary and her team get a tremendous amount of thanks and credit for pulling this together. We worked together at St. Ben's and St. John's, but St. Ben's did a lot of the work for this event. But we also want to thank a number of organizations and individuals that helped support this conversation, recognizing how important it is for institutions and individuals from across the country, maybe even across the world, to get together and talk about the challenges we face in higher education. So let me note our financial sponsors this evening: Credo Foundation, Centricare Health, the Lumina Foundation, Clifton Larson Allen, the College Board, the Lawler Group, TIAA, BK&D, and Ann Schmidt Crump and Paul Crump. Your generosity makes this high-quality programming possible and allows us to have the time and energy to get together and talk in the quiet of the summer about the challenges that face higher education going forward. I want to thank also the American Academy of Arts and Sciences for providing the complimentary publication that's included in your registration book, The Future of Undergraduate Education, The Future of America. I think as you read through that publication, you'll find some things that are very similar to what a lot of our institutions are doing when they talk about the kinds of things that good liberal arts institutions need to be doing. I'm a little biased, but I think that the future of higher education is really to follow the model of great liberal arts educations like we offer at our institutions. But it's possible I'm a little biased. And a very special thank you also to the members of the planning committee that helped create the vision for this. A special thank you to the Association of American Colleges and Universities, the Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges, the Council of Independent Colleges, the Academic Impressions Organization, St. Catherine University, and the Minnesota Private College Council. Lots of very important participants recognize the importance of this conversation. So please, let me ask you to join in a round of applause to thank the many sponsors that helped make this possible tonight. I would also note, and Mary and I will be here throughout the conference, of course, but there are scattered among you approximately 40 members of the St. Ben's and St. John's faculty, administration, and staff. We are a unique model in higher education. If you don't know exactly how St. Ben's and St. John's work, that's not a problem, because we sometimes don't always have it figured out. But the reality is we've been working together at this unique relationship between a men's institution and a women's institution that's completely integrated academically for about 50 years now. But we think that this is a great place to have conversations about the future of higher education, because we think we have a model that obviously wouldn't work in every context, but we think that there are ways in which a model which you might look at on the surface and say, that's crazy, why would you do that? I think we'd like to make the case to you that we do an exceptional job for our students and for our alumni. So if you want to learn a little bit more about what goes on at St. Ben's and St. John's, there are 40 of my colleagues scattered amongst you to act as proselytizers for that fabulous model. So finally, before we get a chance to eat, let me just start, as we often do at St. Ben's and St. John's, with a prayer for our event and for all of us as individuals. First, I want to note that we should start with thanks. In addition to thanking, of course, our sponsors, I think we should be thankful for the many blessings that we have, whatever challenges we face at our institutions. I get up every day thankful for the incredible mission that we have to educate young people in our country and give them a chance to transform their lives. We have a mission that is a vocation for most of the people in this room, and that's an incredible thing to be thankful for. I also think it's important that we have the courage and wisdom to go forward with our mission for our students, for our faculty and staff colleagues, and to do the best possible job we can. So I ask for the courage and wisdom to make the right kinds of choices, to lead the institutions in whatever role all of you play at your own institutions. And then finally, I hope we have the grace to be good colleagues and friends and listeners to our peers as we work with them, regardless of where we are within an organization, and to listen carefully for the needs of our students as we go forward to try to do the best that we possibly can to fulfill our missions on behalf of our students. So thanks, courage, wisdom, and grace. And with that, welcome, and please feel free to start your meals, and we'll be back with the program after you get a chance to have a meal together, after we get a chance to have a meal together. So thank you very much. Good evening. I don't want to interrupt your dinner or good conversations, but also want us to stay on schedule and give you a chance to hear from one of our important guest speakers this evening. So dinner will continue. Dessert will be downstairs after our opening speaker this evening. So please feel free to continue eating. You can't talk to each other though. That would be rude. So it's my honor tonight to introduce our opening session on understanding the current narrative with our plenary speaker, Lynn Pasquerella. Lynn has served in almost all roles that one can imagine in higher education. She was, of course, a student at one point. I should remember that's where higher education starts. But Lynn also got a doctorate in philosophy and served as a faculty member for a number of years. We don't need to do all the exact math here. We'll just say she was a faculty member for, call it a couple decades at the University of Rhode Island, but she also got involved in administrative work there as well in the graduate school. From there, she went to the University of Hartford, where she was an academic administrator provost for a couple of years. And then she became president of her alma mater, Mount Holyoke College, for 6 years. And after that stint, she is now the president of the Association of American Colleges and Universities. AAC&U has consistently provided important resources and advocacy for the liberal arts and liberal education. Their leadership in demonstrating the value of a liberal arts education and in establishing the liberal arts as essential for global citizenship and democracy has greatly informed the program for this conference, and I'm sure it has informed the work of almost everyone in this room. This evening, Dr. Pasquerella will introduce us to the current narrative around higher education in general and the liberal arts in particular. She will begin the conversation about the implications of this narrative on inclusion, institutional success, teaching and learning, and our economic model. Last but certainly not least among our challenges, says The Economist. And she will call us to lead within this conversation. Please join me in welcoming Lynn Pasquerella to the podium.
It really is such an honor and privilege to be here with you this evening, and I'm so grateful to President Hinton and President Hemisath for this opportunity, as well as for the gracious hospitality that I've been shown here. So during the last 6 months, AAC&U has been engaged in implementing a comprehensive integrative strategic plan centered on restoring public trust in the promise of liberal education and inclusive excellence. Launched at our 2018 meeting at the end of January in Washington, D.C., the plan centers on an ascendant narrative that contests accusations of irrelevancy and illegitimacy leveled against higher education in general and liberal education in particular. Yet it also serves as a collective call to action to make visible the transformative power of colleges and universities. And for those of us who believe that higher education is inextricably linked to our nation's historic mission of educating for democracy, the work seems more urgent than ever. This urgency is enhanced by the reality that we're living in an ostensibly post-truth era in which rational inquiry built on evidence has all but been abandoned. Instead, the democratization of information through the internet has resulted in the denial of authoritative knowledge and the disdain of experts. Talk of higher education as a public good, of investing in society through education, and in the case of land-grant institutions, of, quote, promoting the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes in the several pursuits and professions of life, has been replaced by talk of return on investment, tuition in exchange for jobs. Some U.S. politicians have gone so far as to advocate for their state workforce needs by proposing legislation that would base funding for colleges and universities exclusively on job acquisition for college graduates, or stripping out so-called frills such as, quote, the search for truth, public service, and improving the human condition from their university system's mission statements. The rhetoric at the basis of these proposals not only posits a false dichotomy between a liberal education and preparation for work and life, it obscures the reality that colleges and universities continue to represent powerful institutional forces in catalyzing individual and social transformation. Indeed, positing employability as the lone metric for determining higher education's value precludes a consideration of the ways in which the illumination of human consciousness through literature, philosophy, music, and the arts allows us to flourish fully as human beings, enriching our experiences as individuals and as members of the community. As a philosopher whose father spent most of his life working as a welder, I was particularly interested in Florida Senator Marco Rubio's attack on liberal education a few years ago, when he used the dictum that we need more welders and fewer philosophers. And though Senator Rubio has recently recanted his assertion, maintaining after reading the Stoics that he's come to realize we need both welders and philosophers, he was just one voice of many in a chorus of leaders attacking liberal education. Florida Governor Rick Scott had already laid the groundwork by asking, quote, is it of vital interest to the state to have more anthropologists? We don't need a lot more anthropologists in the state. Adding, it's a great degree if people want to get it, but we don't need them here. I want to spend our dollars giving people science, technology, engineering, and math degrees. That's what our kids need to focus on. All of their time and attention on those types of degrees, so when they get out of school, they can get a job. North Carolina's former Governor Patrick McCrory had proposed legislation that would base funding for public colleges and universities exclusively on job acquisition for college graduates, rather than on the number of students enrolled. He said, quote, it's not based on butts and seats, but on how many of those butts can get jobs. Challenging the value of public support for liberal arts majors, he insisted, if you want to take gender studies, that's fine. Go to a private school and take it. But I don't want to subsidize that if it's not going to get someone a job. For similar reasons, Sam Clovis, President Trump's educational policy advisor during the campaign, announced a plan that would deny federal student loans to liberal arts majors at non-elite institutions, while Wisconsin's Governor Scott Walker insisted that a purely technical education is the only way to stand up to global competition. And though he tried to redeem himself by tweeting that he was a politics and English major and learned a lot more from reading novels than textbooks, President Obama also got himself into hot water by proclaiming that folks can make a lot more potentially with skilled manufacturing or trades than they might with an art history degree. These comments each position a liberal education as reserved for those within the ivory tower, reflecting a willful disconnect from the practical matters of everyday life. In doing so, they fuel the image of a liberal education as a self-indulgent luxury, an image that has led to the excising of humanities programs, especially in public institutions, in favor of vocational and pre-professional programs that are regarded as singularly responding to demands for economic opportunity. The narrow focus on earning power undoubtedly makes it easier for state legislatures and taxpayers to justify defending cuts to higher education. This trend has been exacerbated by the recent political jockeying that appeals to people's prejudices and a prevailing national rhetoric that reflects deep partisan divides concerning higher education's value. Thus, the result of a recent Pew Research poll indicates that a majority of respondents from the Republican Party regard colleges and universities not only as failing to have a positive impact on the U.S., but as having a negative impact on the direction of our country. Despite the fact that the same individuals valued their own education and had trust in local institutions, they expressed concern that nationally, college and university campuses have a liberal bias that chills conservative voices and fosters what George Will refers to as a snowflake generation that melts at the slightest abrasion of their sensibilities. The notion that institutions of higher education are bastions of liberal progressivism, tearing apart the fabric of American society, was accompanied by a challenge to the assumption that a college education continues to be a good financial investment. At a time when job prospects for U.S. college graduates remain uncertain and student loan burdens are burgeoning, when the average adult children plan to move out of their parents' home is 27, and when 60% of those in their 20s and 30s are receiving financial support from their parents, there's been a decoupling of higher education from the American dream, especially among certain segments of the population. This perception was highlighted in a recent Kaiser Family Foundation and CNN poll conducted of working-class whites, defined as white Americans without college degrees, in which 51% said that their lives would be no different if they had a 4-year college degree. Standing in stark contrast to working-class blacks and working-class Hispanics, for whom the perceived correlation was much stronger, with 73% of African Americans and 74% of Hispanics maintaining that a 4-year degree would make their lives better. Many white working-class Americans remain skeptical with respect to whether a college degree will enable them to achieve the hallmark of the American dream, namely doing better than one's parents. This is the case even in the face of research indicating that Americans with a 4-year college degree out-earn their peers by 98%. Like Senator Rubio's initial claim that if we privilege vocational over liberal education, we'll be able to increase wages for millions of Americans and be able to leave everyone better off without making anyone worse off. The underlying message is that colleges are too expensive, too difficult to access, and don't teach people 21st century skills. However, the dominant narrative that one's undergraduate major is all that matters, and that only some majors will prepare students for success in the workplace doesn't match the reality. Evidence from AAC&U's own surveys, including the most recent survey in conjunction with Hart Associates of employers and HR managers that will be released next month, confirms that employers regard a graduate's ability to think critically, communicate clearly, solve complex problems in real-world settings with diverse groups, and act ethically is more important than their undergraduate major. Such cross-cutting skills can be developed in a wide variety of chosen disciplines if the courses are well-designed and if they're integrated within robust, problem-based general education programs. A student's undergraduate experience and how well that experience advances critical learning outcomes is what matters most, with 80% of employers agreeing that all students need a strong foundation in the liberal arts and sciences. In a globally interdependent, multicultural world, it's precisely because employers place a premium on innovation in response to rapid change that they emphasize these student experiences rather than narrow technical training. Thus, while the Liberal Arts for All campaign is derided by skeptics as elitist, the real danger of elitism comes from a failure to recognize the disparate impact of such rhetoric on those who are already the most marginalized and underserved members of society. The notion that we need more welders and fewer philosophers, that we should train more engineers than art historians, more people in business and industry than anthropology, and that only those at prestigious institutions should be able to take out loans to study religion, gender studies, or the classics, runs the risk of enhancing inequity by perpetuating what Jefferson referred to as an unnatural aristocracy. For this reason, we need to be vigilant in rebutting charges leveled against the liberal arts and sciences, and to recognize those charges for what they are: collusion in the growth of an intellectual oligarchy in which only the very richest and most prestigious institutions preserve access to the liberal arts traditions. In fact, the most significant challenge facing higher education today is a growing economic segregation. Community colleges and other state institutions enroll more than 3/4 of all students, and yet public education is becoming increasingly privatized. Student aid has failed to keep pace with rising tuition, and the fact that publics have had to do more with less has led to more contingent faculty, larger classes, and widening gaps between publics and privates in spending per student. It's no coincidence that the shift away from the notion of higher education as a public good toward viewing it as a private commodity coincided with opening the gates to women, first-generation college students, students of color, and the poor. College completion rates for those at the lowest socioeconomic rungs continues to lag far behind those of their wealthier peers. However, increasing access to educational opportunity alone is not sufficient to destabilize the reproduction of social inequality in the academy. If we are to make strides toward an equity-minded approach to higher education that spans across the curricular and co-curricular, it extends throughout the entire student experience, we need to reject once and for all a deficit perspective that focuses on what students are missing and offer evidence-based interventions and strategies through the targeting of cognitive, non-cognitive, and psychosocial factors. We need to adopt an asset-based perspective. Only by drawing attention to the persistent economic and cultural barriers that continue to thwart the equity imperative upon which the American dream is built will we be able to fulfill the true promise of American higher education. In the 2017 report of the Wisconsin Hope Lab, Sarah Goldrick-Robb, Jed Richardson, and Anthony Hernandez unveiled growing rates of food insecurity among community college students, with 2 out of 3 experiencing this phenomenon. At the same time, half of the students within this population report shelter insecurities, and 13 to 14% identify as homeless. Moreover, as Sia Vershelden unveils in her book Bandwidth Recovery, research shows that factors such as poverty, racism, and social marginalization contribute to diminished cognitive bandwidth as well, reducing the likelihood of students learning, persisting, and graduating from college. Responding to these challenges requires acknowledging and acting to redress burgeoning attainment and achievement gaps and disparities in college readiness, access to resource-rich institutions, and spending per student. It requires investigating the rates at which students of color are removed from classrooms for disciplinary problems, suspended from school, subject to over-surveillance and incarceration. Perhaps most importantly, it requires examining the ways in which the language of and assumptions about diversity, equity, and inclusion perpetuate college and university campuses as sites of exclusion by privileging those with social and cultural capital. When the board of directors of AAC&U expanded the organization's mission in 2012 to embrace inclusive excellence as inextricably linked to liberal education, the goal was to signal a commitment to the ideal that access to excellence for all students, not just the privileged, is essential not only for our nation's economy, but more importantly for our democracy. Democracy cannot flourish in a nation divided between haves and have-nots. Therefore, the presumption that college is only about workforce training is dangerous to our democratic future. A liberal education for the 21st century mandates the acceleration of integrative, high-impact learning opportunities that engage every student in solving unscripted real-world problems across all types of institutions. The emphasis of the curriculum should be on learning outcomes, knowledge of human cultures and the physical and natural world, intellectual and practical skills, personal and social responsibility, integrative and applied learning as necessary for all students' intellectual, civic, personal, and professional development, and for success in a global economy. Assignments should make clear the relationships among areas of knowledge, ensuring that students do not see academic disciplines as separate and disconnected silos of learning, but rather as varied approaches to the same enlightened end. On this model, disciplinary work remains foundational, but students are provided with faculty-guided practice, connecting their disciplines with others, with the co-curriculum, and with the needs of society across the curriculum from their first to final semester. Integrative learning and thematic pathways that address grand challenges across disciplines and within the major, requiring students to integrate and apply their knowledge to new problems, is an imperative for student success. Developing this type of deeper level understanding across subject areas, connecting knowledge and experience, and adopting a holistic approach to evidence-based problem solving that incorporates diverse, sometimes contradictory points of view, is more important than ever, and is one of the best approaches to cultivating the perception, intellectual agility, and creative thinking necessary for students to thrive in a globally interdependent, innovation-fueled economy. Yet most importantly, it recognizes that decision-making must be grounded in the ethical principles of respect for persons, justice, and beneficence. This conclusion was validated in a report, Branches of the Same Tree, issued at the end of May by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. I served on the committee, a project of the Board of Higher Education and the Workforce, which was directed to examine whether the integration of the arts and humanities with science, engineering, math, and medicine can improve learning outcomes for all students. The title of the report was taken from a quote by Albert Einstein, who wrote in a letter written in 1937 amidst the backdrop of burgeoning fascist power in Central Europe, and expressed consternation over the dangerous implications of, quote, living in a society where long-established foundations of knowledge are corrupted, manipulated, and coerced by political forces. Einstein maintained that, quote, all religions, arts, and sciences are branches from the same tree. The report found the need to achieve more effective forms of capacity building for 21st century workers and citizens through the acquisition of broad-based skills across all disciplines. They sought to provide an education that can be flexibly deployed in different work environments across a lifetime. The report concludes that, quote, in a world where science and technology are major drivers of social change, historical, ethical, aesthetic, and cultural competencies are more critical than ever. At the same time, the complex and often technical nature of contemporary issues in democratic governance demands that well-educated citizens have an appreciation of the nature of technical knowledge and of its historical, cultural, and political roles in American democracy. For truly robust knowledge depends on the capacity to recognize the critical limitations of particular ways of knowing and to achieve the social relations appropriate to an inclusive and democratic society. This is not just a matter of making our research on critical social issues understandable and available to the broader public or practicing the scholarship of engagement. Instead, colleges and universities must transition away from the expert model of knowledge generation to publicly active scholarship, which enacts democratic engagement designed to promote a more equitable society by partnering with K through 12, business, industry, and citizens themselves. If we hope to bolster the reputation of higher education within democratic society, we need to have a visible impact, demonstrating that we're true partners anchored in the communities in which we live. This model of publicly active scholarship breaks down barriers and establishes a bilateral relationship between research expertise and local epistemologies, public and private, scholar and citizen, that can serve to erode partisanship resulting from competing ideologies. The discussion around skills versus content, the meaningfulness and usefulness of the pragmatic liberal arts, the primary purpose of education as fostering lifelong learning, and the need to provide our students with opportunities to reflect on why they are being asked to do the work required of them in order to be able to tell a story about how those experiences are transferable must be placed in conversation with discussions about how we assess students, train and reward future faculty, and demonstrate success. Unfortunately, we're at a point in our history when the professional structures of academic scholarship, with its tendency to neglect teaching excellence, outreach, civic engagement, and public intellectualism, are alienated from a more widespread comportment to human life, and thus from the very purposes of a liberal education. Until we change both the curricula and the reward systems within the academy, structural impediments will continue to marginalize the critical work of those dedicated to providing the broadest access to higher education through humanistic practice that reaches beyond the gates. Of course, higher education needs and feeds upon specialization, and I certainly wouldn't recommend abandoning technical and intricate research as a foundation for addressing questions and fueling endeavors. But such activity should be measured in humanistic terms, not by eliminating scholarship, but by broadening what we value as an expression of that mastery. And yet at present, we go so far as to discourage pre-tenured faculty from focusing too much on teaching and service. Activities engaging actual questioning human beings, whether in the classroom or in the community, drop out of professional focus. Academic institutions should actively reconsider pathways to recruitment, tenure, and promotion, placing scholarship in reasonable balance with humanistic modes of activity in the classroom and beyond. In the same way, not all scholars need to serve as public intellectuals, yet those who do must cultivate rich forms of practice and collaborate with those who have technical expertise beyond the academy, including both consulting and exploiting media to get to enduring questions. If we relinquish the opportunities that would extend our reach and leave these channels of communication to the media moguls, public discourse will continue to decline, and academicians will lose the chance to engender a true sense of wonder purely for the sake of didacticism. If academics rely exclusively on the mechanics of arcane study to get out our message, failing to utilize the most vibrant vectors for helping citizens to cope with humanistic questions, scholarly pursuits as anything more than an ossified depository of ancient curiosity will die. Individuals will still thirst for humanistic guidance in seeking answers to their questions and compass points for their endeavors. But the academy as an institution will become nothing more than self-referential as the frames of humanistic practice disappear forever. Canadian philosopher Mark Kingwell notes that while those of us in the academy may eschew populism and its condemnation of life in the ivory tower, quote, we're losing when it comes to reason and critical intelligence and civility. We are losing when it comes to the basic justification of what we do. We are losing on defending universities as forces for good. I was reminded of Kingwell on my way here when I received an email from a Mount Holyoke alumna who was upset that the Boulder Daily Camera printed a letter to the editor that quoted me out of context. The letter was in response to an article written by a reporter who interviewed me about the University of Colorado Board of Regents considering a proposal that would eliminate the words liberal education from the university's mission statement. At the end of the interview, the reporter asked me, what could a liberal education possibly do for someone studying medicine or law or engineering? As a medical ethicist, I talked about the ways in which technological advancements often precede thoughtful reflection about the ethical, legal, and social implications of the use of that technology, especially around end-of-life issues. Here's how what I said was interpreted by the author of the letter. Quote, last week, the Daily Camera published an article about CU dropping the word liberal from its description of the type of education it provides. The article provided yet one more example of what is really wrong with our major colleges and universities. In the article, Lynn Pasquerella, the president of the Association of American Colleges and Universities, states, quote, "The best education that we can offer students is one in which students are required to engage with real-world problems across disciplines. Anyone who has followed, even peripherally, what has happened to free speech at college campuses understands the hypocrisy embedded in that statement. Can you imagine the uproar that would ensue if colleges and universities were to take seriously Pasquerella's charge and require students to actually engage with real-world problems?" Pasquerella continues by citing a benefit of liberal education that integrates the arts and sciences. As could be predicted from someone who has been pickled in the coddled atmosphere of higher education for her entire professional life, Pasquerella perhaps unwittingly uses an example of how 4 years at most colleges is an expensive exercise in avoiding reality. She explains that a liberal education can inform doctors in making decisions that involve a person's right to die. Heaven forbid that a doctor would learn during their university education that perhaps religious beliefs in education might play into how they handle this question, but no need for God or religion when a good liberal education can answer every question. The perfect example of the dream world Pasquerella lives in comes from Mount Holyoke College, where she was last president. A student there wrote that at Mount Holyoke, quote, "We are politically aware and active, but there are Republicans too." Now that's the real world. So, beyond the writer's concerns about freedom of expression and the disconnect between the academy and the real world, his comments reflect a deep-seated belief that a liberal education fails to countenance and disrupts the values he holds most dear, particularly religious values. By putting the word higher in the phrase higher education in quotes, he also signals a message that those of us in colleges and universities intend to stigmatize the working class. I smiled when I read his words because they recalled conversations I had with my own family. I was a first-generation college student whose parents didn't graduate from high school. My father joined the war effort at the age of 16 following Pearl Harbor Day and went on to serve in the Korean War. Before he was shipped out, he and my mother had a small wedding ceremony at the Annapolis Naval Base. My mother was 16, and it was a time when girls were not allowed to stay in school if they were married, so my mother gave up her dream of becoming an English teacher. My parents spent their lives in factories, valued hard work, and were committed to community. We attended church every Sunday, and I tagged along with my mother as she gave blood, sang in the community choir, was in the bowling league at Friendly Bowl, played in the bridge club, led a troop of brownies, went to meetings of the Daughters of Isabella, and voted. My parents were both registered Republicans. I rode with my father, who worked third shift at Pratt & Whitney, when he volunteered daily during the summers as a bus driver, bringing children with special needs to the camp at Mashmucket State Park. At 17, when I graduated from high school, I decided to forego a full scholarship to my state's flagship university to stay home and be a caregiver for my mother, who had become chronically ill. I attended a local community college, working 35 hours a week under the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, at the time reserved for those at risk of permanent unemployment. With the additional help of Pell Grants and Perkins loans, I transferred to Mount Holyoke College 2 years later. I know firsthand what it's like to do piecework alongside my mother and to have to make a quota in order for the women alongside you to get paid at the end of the week, to find refuge in the family car because there's no place else to go, to stand in line as a Mount Holyoke student with someone behind a counter yelling at me, Title 19 patients, go over there, and to be equally familiar with two groups or cultures, and yet to feel at home in neither. I was convinced every time I walked across the campus at Mount Holyoke that someone would discover me as someone who didn't really deserve a place in the academy. My father was proud of me and wanted me to have an easier life than he had. But when I invited him to attend my graduation ceremony when I received my PhD from Brown University, he said, First of all, I'm not going to spend 35 cents a gallon to go up that hill in Providence. Second of all, this tells you how long ago it was. Second of all, don't you think this makes you better than us? Because it doesn't. A simple congratulations would have been fine. But I realized then, as I do now, the anxiety born of class structures in the U.S. and the real fear that arises in some families, as in my own, from imagining that the education of their children will result in a destabilizing of family unities and shared values. Undoubtedly, one of the primary functions of a liberal education is to engender in students the understanding that some of their most fundamentally held beliefs might actually be mistaken. Yet I was able to sit down at the kitchen table with my father and convince him that the privilege of such an education would not lead me to break with my past or family traditions in the ways that worried him. We need to ask what these table conversations would sound like at the national level. If people's beliefs are based more on tribalism than reason, in addressing the misinformation and incivility resulting from the destabling impact of rhetoric for hire, we need to redouble our focus on world citizenship and the interdependence of all human beings and communities as the foundation for liberal education. Understanding that anger, hostility, and pity each carry the risk of creating barriers to that humanistic identification. Finding commonality among individuals with radically different perspectives and offering a starting point for collective social transformation carries new import. To restore public trust in higher education and destabilize the cultural attitudes at the basis of proposals that devalue liberal education, we need to demonstrate in a more compelling way to those outside of the academy, Democrats and Republicans alike, the extent to which we are, in fact, teaching students 21st century skills, preparing them to solve our most pressing problems at the global and national and local levels within the context of the workforce, not apart from it. Further, it's time for us to insert ourselves in the public discourse and debates over public policy and collectively reaffirm the role that a liberal education plays in discerning the truth, the ways in which it serves as a catalyst for interrogating the sources of narratives, including history, evidence, and facts, the ways in which a liberal education promotes an understanding that the world is a collection of interdependent yet inequitable systems, the ways in which it expands knowledge of human interactions, privilege, and stratification, and the ways in which higher education fosters equity and justice locally and globally. My inaugural message to the AAC and community when I was appointed as president referenced a letter written in May of 1863 by Emily Dickinson to two of her cousins. In a nation enmeshed in the Civil War, she confessed, quote, "I must keep gas burning to light the danger up so I could distinguish it." The poet's words reflect her unflinching pursuit of the truth and the need she felt to move beyond her own narrow viewing point. Dickinson wanted to light the danger up, not to turn away from it. She sought to look at what others either could not or did not want to see. In the midst of national dissension and uncertainty, she strove to use every ounce of her being in the process of discovery, perhaps understanding that deliberative democracy, especially in times of crisis, relies on the creation of a critical public culture that foments reasoned debate and independent thought. 100 years later, during the 1963 March on Washington, in a nation still divided, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, quote, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. This is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action." King was advocating for what he referred to as dangerous altruism, contending that the real question of life is whether an individual is able to say, I do this not because of what it means for me, but because of what it will mean to my brother if I fail to do it. Today, in a country in which partisan divides are greater than they have been in more than half a century, in a world in which the oceans are rising and civility is plummeting, paying attention to the object lessons of both Dickinson and King is more crucial than ever. We need to light up the danger and illuminate the transformative power of a liberal education. At the same time, we need to face the fierce urgency of now and engage in dangerous altruism, recognizing that higher education and its graduates must play a leadership role in jettisoning a belief in a hierarchy of human value and fulfilling the promise of the American dream. Thank you.
Lynn has agreed to answer a few questions, so we have about 5 minutes, and microphones will be provided. So if you have a question, if you'll raise your hand, we'll get the mic to you, and Lynn can respond. This did not happen in the storm cellar last time.
We're also always happy to take advice. You don't have to just answer a question.
Mary, please. Oh, so John?
Lynn, that's a terrific speech. I'm John McGee. I work here at St. Ben's and St. John's. That was really terrific.
Thank you.
I wonder about, we have I don't know if it's a cultural proclivity or tendency, if it's a sign of times, to put things in the context of either or. It's this or that. When that's not the way any of us really can live our lives. So liberal education has been put into the either or category. Mm-hmm. It's either useful or it's not, or a 4-year degree or a 2-year degree. It has to be one or the other, when in fact it seems, and this is more of a statement, but I'm asking if you could comment on this, that it seems that there is ample space, and not just space, but need for both. So how do you move the dialogue from either or choices that are actually false, or to use contemporary language, fake news, mm-hmm. to something that is more comprehensive, inviting, that allows space for different perspectives, different values, and different choices, rather than the sort of cultural compulsion to choose one or the other, and in choosing it, demeaning the other?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the question we're trying to answer. There is this false dichotomy that's been created. The prevailing national rhetoric certainly fuels that false dichotomy. So I think the best thing that we can do is to make visible to people outside of academia the ways in which the work that we're doing actually connects with the kinds of day-to-day concerns that they have. It's one of the reasons I do the academic minute. So Mary was mentioning this, radio show that I do on NPR every day. It's 90 seconds because it's an academic minute after all. But it introduces listeners to public radio. What's going on in classrooms and in research labs across the country and around the world, and it airs on Armed Forces Radio. Without that, there is this notion that we are asking questions. My husband asked me this, he's an entomologist. He asked me this the other day. He said, do philosophers still talk about how many angels there are on their heads of a pin? And I said, yes, we do, and there's a good reason for it. But that's the sort of thing that seems like completely disconnected from the reality of the lives of individuals. So how do we make the case? And it's often not clear. I've told this story to some of you before. My son Pierce is in television and film production, and throughout his college career, he railed against the liberal education that he was indeed privileged to receive. He said, I don't understand Why have to take these courses? He said, all I want to do is be behind a camera. Why am I taking courses in small group communication and intercultural competence? This is just a way for the college. This is the college of which I was the provost. This is just a way for the college to get our money. There's no point having to jump through these hoops for no reason. So, and one day I was sitting in the library in the president's house at Mount Holyoke, and I was working on a speech, and Pierce's twin brother, Spencer, was working on his PhD dissertation, and my husband, John, who's an entomologist, was reading a book. And Pierce came in, and he said, "This is the most dysfunctional family on the planet. This is a beautiful day, and all you're doing is studying. We should be out there doing things. You're doing nothing." Pierce went off and got his master's degree, slogged through this. And the first job that he got was with the Jerry Springer Show. So there he learned that we are, in fact, not the most dysfunctional family on the planet. There are others. But he called me one day, and he said, "Mom, guess what?" He said, "I got to book the talent today, and I had to run out and get them ties and cigarettes. And then he said, I had to spend 2 hours in the green room with them." And he said, "Now I understand the value of a liberal education." This is a true story. He said, "I understand why I had to take those courses in small group communication and intercultural competence. I was able to carry on a conversation with people I had nothing in common with, and yet we were together for that time." So I thought, here's a child who's raised in an academic household. His mother's a college president. His father's been a professor for 40 years. And he couldn't understand this. We need to help our students understand the connection between the work that we're asking them to do in the classroom and their career aspirations. We also need to make the same kind of case for those outside of the academy in terms of what it is that we're doing in the academy and what they're doing in their daily lives. So this is something we can do together. I'm convinced of it.
Hi, I'm Lucy Lipovsky. So you alluded to the fact that our colleges are having economic challenges, and one of the challenges is how do we make people agree to pay for the education we're giving? I mean, until we get people willing to pay, those especially who are able to pay for it, we're not going to, the quality of what we're able to offer continues to get diminished. So how do you see us turning that corner?
Well, this is a challenge, especially, as I mentioned, with the state disinvestment in higher education, the implications for state institutions. I know when I was at the University of Rhode Island, when I started in 1985, we were getting 44% of our support from the state. When I left in 2008, it was down to 7%. It's now about 4%. And so we were always pressured to get more out-of-state students in order to provide greater tuition resources, which all went back to the state anyway. And so I was afraid that we weren't meeting the mission of the state, which was to educate the students in the state of Rhode Island. Privates are facing, independent colleges are facing changing demographics, especially in rural regions, and looking at the fact that they're competing with institutions which previously were not competitors. And so having to take into account new competition, developing new programs when other institutions with more resources are developing them first. And then how do we deal with a shifting student population of veterans, of returning adult students, of students who've been at 2 or 3 other institutions? How do we compete with the unbundling of a college education, the for-profits? With the current administration, the fear with the Reauthorization of Higher Education Act is that it allows, the proposed Reauthorization Act allows for the complete outsourcing of a student's education to corporations and to for-profits. So how do we compete with that? If a student says, well, I can go to work for 3 months and get a college degree at the same time, then why should I pay for a 2-year, 4-year college education? So we need to think about ways that we can partner with different types of institutions to ensure that there are pathways of access and success for all students who come to us. But this is part of why we're here today, and that is to create a narrative that will welcome people in to the community and to demonstrate the investment of an education, in particular liberal education.
Any other questions for Lynn? Yes.
Hi, Lynn. My name is Donna Hay. I'm from the Washington Center for Internships and Academic Seminars. I was really curious. You said that in 2012, AAC&U made an intentional decision to broaden its mission to explicitly state the link between inclusion and liberal education. Mm-hmm. And I'm really curious, even more so, to understand a little bit what prompted such an explicit decision, all right? Was that potentially implied but not yet acted upon enough? And if so, what was it that then changed after that decision?
Well, it was a board decision, and I think it was really my predecessor, Carol Gary Schneider, who had talked quite a bit about the need for a 21st century education as involving students in addressing unscripted real-world problems with diverse groups of individuals, recognizing that we could not possibly offer the quality in undergraduate education without equity in terms of a diverse student body. And so there was seen as this inextricable link. We had talked about inclusive excellence. We wanted to make sure that it was visible in our mission statement. And so now we talk about it in terms of the revised mission statement talks about advancing liberal education, quality and equity in undergraduate education in service to democracy. So we see all of these as really inextricable components to the same end.
Please join me in thanking Lynn.
Thank you.
Lynn certainly shared with us a compelling call to action, and I hope that everyone in the room feels the sense of urgency that she conveyed. So that's a great way for us to start the day tomorrow. We are absolutely delighted that so many teams have chosen to join us for this conversation. And beginning tomorrow morning, you'll be seated with your team. If you look on your name tag in the lower left corner, you will see a table number. So your team will be seated together, and there may be another team at your table or single registrants. We've thoughtfully tried to put groups together. This will help position us well for the team discussions and action planning portions of the workshops over the next day and a half. So you'll see your table assignment. You should certainly take advantage of that opportunity. We will start early tomorrow. You can enjoy breakfast as early as 7:30 a.m. back in this room, and our opening workshop will start at 8:30 a.m. But for now, we invite you to continue the conversation with a backdrop of lovely music and abundant desserts just downstairs in the Gorecki Fireside Lobby. So if you'll head down one flight of stairs, there's a lovely dessert buffet, a musical accompaniment. We hope you'll have wonderful conversations with one another. We look forward to welcoming you back at 8:30 a.m. tomorrow morning. And again, thank you, Lynn, for wonderful remarks and for a great call to action. Have a good evening.